our long-range facility planning committee. First off, just a thank you to all of you who have volunteered to be here for the next several meetings. Obviously, it's a condensed timeline that we have, and so we have lots to cover along the way. But I know that there's sacrifice in there, whether or not you have kids who are playing in sports or in after-school activities right now that you might be missing, preparing for AP exams and other things for our students or whatnot. But just thank you for being here. In some ways, this is, I mean, as I look around faces in the room, it's like a history of my time in the school district. Everything from parents of kids I've had at Lake Ridge as principal, to my time in the school district working with former school board members, current school board members, and others. But my name is Fred Rundle. If I haven't met you personally, this is my 14th year in our school district, and first as the superintendent. And as I've told others along the way, I loved being a principal. That was one of the very best jobs I ever had, and I liked being a director, and I liked being an assistant superintendent. But actually, I like being a superintendent a lot more. It's more like being a principal again. I just have more students, more families, and more schools. But before I turn it over to Malum and our facilitators for this meeting, we're going to do introductions there. But, you know, we have a huge task ahead of us as a committee. And I say us, but it's really you as a committee. We have a number of us who will be here for along the way for the ride, providing you information, providing updates, but really we're listening because the schools aren't built for us, they're built for students. And we want to make sure that we are attuned to our student voices and to you who have families. Some of you have kids, as we were catching up, Toby and I were, who have launched and they're into the world and on their own and no longer on the payroll. And others of you have kids who aren't even in our system yet. And so it's a wide range and spectrum. I had an absolute tremendous time helping to design, along with our architects and others, this building here. And I know the power of rejuvenation of facilities. But we have to think about, what do we own and what do we already have? What are our assets? And are those sufficient right now? To do and carry out the programming that we want for our students. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But also, as we think about the demographics on our island, do we have the right facilities? Do we have the right number of facilities? And so we need to be tackling all of those as we think about 3, 5, and 10 years down the road. I had a chance as an elementary staff member to help open up an elementary school in Colorado as a 4th grade teacher. When I entered that school district, it was elementary 38. And when I left 8 years later, they were building it was elementary 32. And when I left 8 years later, they were building elementary 48. And I got to also open up high school number 7 when I was in that school district as a teacher. And when I left, they were opening up high school number 9. So I've been in a system that's had rapid growth with lots of facilities and whatnot, and we've benefited here in our community as we've seen that growth happen over time, as we built a new elementary school, as we started on our project at the middle school, building half of that, and then our high school. But we're at the point now where we've got other decisions that we need to make. And so thank you ahead of time for all of your wisdom and thinking about the programming, because ultimately, as we look back to students, that's our most important focus. And do we have the right facilities that can offer the right programs for our students? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leroy Landers. He's with Malum Architecture. We'll do introductions and whatnot. We've had a partnership with Malum since the design of this school, which Malum Architects was part of. And then also our last long-range facility planning committee, which took place right before the pandemic. Leroy helped us with the facilitation there. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us, Fred. Yeah, you'll be back shortly. I will. All right. And I just want to echo too, Fred's sentiment of thanking you all. We understand that you've got a bazillion things that you could be doing right now, eating dinner for one. And so we really appreciate the time that you've taken to come here. And I would just say that really the service that you're providing to this community is, I think personally, one of the more exciting and important services that you could provide. Because you're really going to be giving some key input into a core institution on Mercer Island, at your schools, right? So this is a great opportunity, and I can assure you that the district and the board will be listening very carefully to what you said and what your recommendations will be. So you probably already got some of this going here. If you haven't already turned off your phone, please do that. Let's talk a little bit about what we're covering tonight. I also want to apologize up front because we're going to be hitting you with a lot of information tonight. So just hang in there as best you can. The meetings after this will not look like this meeting. We're really dumping a lot of information on you that will hopefully be useful as we enter the next 3 meetings and you're actually thinking about plan development. We're going to start really quickly with some introductions. And then some of you, I know here, I see some faces from a couple of years ago are familiar with the previous long-range planning effort. Others are new here, and so we're going to give you a little bit of a high-level overview of what happened. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to take a look at not only the previous long-range facility plan, which is posted on the website, but also the issue papers that are about these kind of topics here. If you haven't had the opportunity to go and read those, please do before our next meeting, because it'll give you a lot more detailed information that'll be useful, because we can only hit a certain time level here. We've kind of roughly broken this down into more or less hour chunks, not exactly, with a 5-minute break. This first break, we're actually going to give you a little more of a break because there'll be some food out here for you at that point, so you can get some food and drink at that point. And at the end of each section, we'll give an opportunity for a brief Q&A. So I would ask you, in view of the time we have together, to hold your questions until we reach the Q&A associated with each of these topics, and then you can kind of ask us what's been on your mind as we present this material. The second portion of this will touch on vision and educational programs. Fred's going to be so kind as to cover that. Then facility condition, we'll take another quick break. The last segment is going to be touching on enrollment and capacity. And then finally, school district financing and the next steps after this meeting. So our goals for this evening are hopefully for you to be able to understand a little bit about the previous long-range facility plan, both the process and some of the thinking that really came out of it. And we're hoping that that good thought that the committee worked on 2 or 3 years ago will really work as a springboard to kind of lead us forward with the work that you're going to be able to do and help along here. We'd like you to understand what the district vision and goals are that are going to help inform this process, and Fred's going to talk a little bit about that. And also develop a high-level understanding of what we're calling facility-related need. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a few minutes, and talk a bit about what has changed since the 2020 long-range facility plan. And then understand the histories and parameters of funding. So Matt will be talking about funding in the district and how that really works and the different types of funding in the district. Quickly touching on Malin. For those of you who may not be familiar with us and wonder why we're even here in the room working with you guys, Malin has got offices in Seattle and in Portland. We've been a firm for more than 80 years now, and throughout that whole period of time, one of our key areas of focus has been learning environments for pre-K education. We also do higher education and healthcare as well, but this is really a core area for us, this pre-K through 12 education. And that really spans the full gamut. So we do everything from early programming through planning, like we're talking about now, to the actual design of buildings like the one you're in right now that we're fortunate enough to work with the school district on. And the core team that's going to be working with you are myself here, I'm principal at Malin, David Young, who's over here, is principal and partner at Malin, and then Jennifer Lubin, who couldn't be here this evening, but she really does all the real work for us. She is the brain trust for us. And then quick introduction for the leadership team over here. Of course, you met Fred. Matt is in the back, Matt Sullivan, Tony here, and Brandy back there too. And so they'll be in the room listening to the conversations, and they will also serve as a resource. If you have highly detailed questions at some point along this whole process, and I'm unable to answer them, which could very well be the case, then I'll look to them and hopefully they'll be able to provide some of the background or answers that you might have to your question. We thought it would be nice to kind of quickly go around the room, maybe for a minute or even 30 seconds or whatever, and let's just introduce everyone to everyone. And if you just would state your name and maybe a little bit of your connection to the district, whether you're a current parent or a previous parent or a grandparent, or you've worked on committees before, just so we get a chance to sort of, everyone can see who's here. So let's start with the board member.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deborah Lurie. I am here as a representative of the board of directors. It is my, sixth year on the board. I am a Mercer Island alum, and I also have a junior at the high school.
I'm Deanna Lean. I also have a junior at the high school. Yes, to some of the others here. And we have been on the island for 18 years. We've seen a lot of, the things that have gone on politically on the island, as well as funding wise. Have touched every aspect of the system in that K-12, but specifically right now, I'm here really thinking about fine arts as well as the CCR or CTE, robotics programs, and really having that perspective and that lens on it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jenny Harrington Lill. I have 4 children, 2 who have graduated, and 1 in the I'm Janelle Princess. I'm a parent. I have a sophomore at the high school. I'm also on staff at the high school now as a parapro. Primarily at Crest is where I work. And then I'm also a former PTA leader. I was on leadership at Lakeridge PTA and also PTA council.
Thank you.
When I started off a few years ago, I was president of the Mercer Island Preschool Association. Now I have 2 kids that I'm part of. So I shifted and now I'm a parent. I'm Susan Conrad one. And thank you. I'm on the PTA at well. So that's an interest, that little want to see what we can do for them as they grow up.
And I should say too, if you were on the previous committee, as you were, say that too, so that the folks who were not on the committee can know where the resources are.
I'm Jessie Clausen. I'm new. I had a kindergartner at Island Park and another little Island Park.
I'm Ralph Jorgensen. I have 2 daughters that went through and graduated from high school. Former school board director. Pretty involved with a number of people here as well in terms of helping with the bond and other campaigns in the past. And electrical engineer, but now past 3 years been teaching math, not at Northwood Elementary School, but at Northwood Middle School, which is the 10th school.
I'm Bingley Hall. I was I have a very nice school. Hi, I'm Jennifer Crespi. I'm a transplant from New York. I moved here probably 6-7 years ago. I have 2 boys, one an Islander and one at Mercer. And I'm just kind of involved in PTA and where the kids are doing and in the community as well. So looking forward to working with everyone. I'm Debbie Burr, and I've been in the district for a long time. I have 2 in various stages of college, and then our youngest is a sophomore at the school. And I'm officially representing PTA Council, which held lots of different roles over the years. So,
I'm Kate Snacks. I was part of the previous committee. I have 2 kiddos at Lakeridge and at IMS.
And I work in, design and building at the kind of intersection of green building and social justice. And that's kind of the perspective that I'm bringing.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
I'm Lee Tortorelli. I'm with the Mercer Island Police Department. Alice, instructor, active shooter instructor, SWAT team member. I'm not the SRO, but I fill in quite a bit for the SRO. And prior to law enforcement, I was actually a high school teacher.
Great. Thanks for being here.
I'm Matt Hall. I have a daughter at Lake Ridge and a 3-year-old son who'll be going there soon. We've been on the island for 3 years, but my wife went through the whole school district here and been around a little bit in some degree or another for the last 15 or 20 years here. Yeah, before living here.
I'm Asha Warner. I'm a junior at the high school and I'm also the junior student school board representative. And so I'm really excited. This is my first time on the team.
I'm Andrew House and I'm the senior school board representative. We represent K through 12 student voices. This is also my first time on this committee.
I'm Sophie Cartwright. I'm a current junior at Matern High School and I want to come to offer my perspective as someone who's been in the district my entire education.
I'm Toby Sue. I'm a veteran parent with 2 daughters who graduated, one in 2011, one in 2015. I worked on a prior long-range planning committee, although not the 2019 one. I was involved in the team that spent a year putting together the bond proposal for replacing, rebuilding all 3 schools, and that one failed, but led to the Northridge or Northwood and middle school bond that did finally pass.
Great. Thanks for being here.
I'm Dan Glowitz, current school board member. I have 2 kids that are in the district, a 7th grader and a 5th grader. And I'm also a graduate of Mercer Island High School, the last 5, the last minute.
Thanks for coming.
Hi, my name is Rich Nikatsu. It's my first time here. My daughter, she's in 7th grade right now. I'm also representing the Mercer Island, the orchestra booster. I'm the vice president.
Becky Shadow, Boys and Girls Club, but also former parent in the district and the previous.
Brian Mock, I have 3 kids in the school district. I've got a senior for another 6 or 8 weeks, whatever that is. A freshman daughter, and then I have an 8th grader, all active in sports, and back to season all the time. And I'm also a product of the school district. I went to kindergarten at West Mercer, elementary school at Lake Ridge, middle school, and then graduated from high school.
All right. Great. Thank you. Welcome. You're on the spot. Just a quick introduction. You are your connection to the school district, and if you served on the last committee or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Sandra Levin, and yes, I served on the last committee, and I have 2 graduates from the system and 1 who's about to enter high school. So.
All right. Thank you.
Then there's 2 more. Andrew Bronzer, who, because he's returning again, our instructional technology director, and then Ian Henry, who's our communications coordinator with our school district as well.
Great. Thanks, Brad. All right. So what do we hope you can do for us? Facility planning committee. In no order of priority necessarily. We hope that you will consistently attend our meetings and actively participate. Consistency is quite important because as you'll see, there's sort of a thread or a continuity of thought that starts to happen along the way. And if you miss a meeting in the middle, it starts to really make it difficult for you to participate as fully. So leave that there. We're always asking you to work with the big pictures, try and zoom back out and really think about all the different factors that we're going to be talking about in view of the big picture. We know that there are individual details and specific interests amongst the group, and certainly feel free to bring those out, but always within the context of that bigger picture. We hope that you will express your point of view. That's why you're here, and hopefully it will be a very knowledgeable point of view. That's our job, to give you the information you need to be able to have that knowledge. And then also, of course, be open to other folks' viewpoints as well. Be respectful in the space. That's very important. We're looking for you to provide input regarding various long-range plan options that are really going to come from you, that you're going to develop. And provide, and by doing so, as taxpayers, those of you who are taxpayers here, you'll also be providing some insight into public support for potential capital funding. So when we get into this, we're not really presuming necessarily that capital funding will be involved. That's up for you to consider, and tell us if you think that's appropriate. And if you sort of end up crossing that bridge, we'll also be trying to get a rough understanding of the level of that as well. And all of this information really is going to start boiling down into some recommendations that you will be able to give to the district and the board. And the real key is the term recommendation. Okay, so this is your perspective as community members. And again, the board and the district will consider those very seriously, and then determine how that really works into any actions they may take moving forward. As part of this too, as this develops over time, because you are going to have some of the deepest information about facilities in the district, some of the best understanding about them, you will be able to serve as ambassadors both for the process and any questions that your other community members may have. So hopefully you'll be able to fulfill that role as well. It is not going to be your responsibility to lead this process, so we'll be walking you through that this process ourselves. And then it's not up to you to make any final decisions regarding what's done with this. That is going to really be left to the board and the district based on, to some extent, the recommendations that you may be given. And of course, it's not your role to establish policy. So what do the meetings look like? Here we are today. Again, this is just going to be a huge brain dump of a lot of information. So I again apologize for that up front. We're hitting you with a lot of stuff. But the following 3 meetings are really about plan development. And that's where you will much more actively begin to get together as a committee and start to discuss, think about, and take action on what might be making sense for you regarding the path forward and what you might do or not do with the facilities. All right, so let's hit really quickly the previous work that was done. So the previous long-range plan back in 2019. And then the idea is, as much as we can, to try and use that as a springboard or leverage it for all the discussions we're having at this phase of the work. So the way that really fell out is that the district hired Malin to assist in the development of that plan back in 2019. It was about a 9-month process or so that unfortunately ended up getting impacted by the COVID pandemic. And really the only impact it did have was it limited our ability to really go out and have a broader community outreach, which had been the intent, but we couldn't really do that very effectively. And so what that effort was really about, similar to what you're going to be doing, is to understand the thank you. Work to understand the district goals and facility related needs. So we're going to be talking about that again tonight. And develop a prioritized list of projects to address that need over the next 10 years. And I do want to emphasize here that the idea of identifying a list of projects was not necessarily a given for that committee. We didn't come in and say, oh, you're going to develop a list of projects. The first question we asked them is, based on the need that you see here, do you think that anything needs to be done at all? Or are your facilities okay? Meaning you wouldn't need any projects. And so that group felt that there probably at some point should be some projects that were undertaken, and you'll see those in a few minutes. And this was completed in 2020, that long-range plan, with the clear understanding that there was no bond measure or any sort of capital plan associated with it, but maybe someday in the future there would be. And so as part of that, no detailed list of specific projects was really developed. And there was the knowledge that the community planning work that was done would have to be revisited at a future point in time. And that's where we are right now. So a high level overview, I think, of just sort of the structure of what we're talking about can be very useful. You heard me talk about areas of need or facility need. That need is very broad. There are many different types of need that impact facilities. And we have found it very useful to structure all of the different types of need in sort of three main categories. Those categories are education program. So those are the programs that are really being taught at your schools. And the need can be things like either changes that are happening in your existing programs. It could be programs that are being grown or adding new programs. There's a whole list of things here. A lot of topics come out of that. STEM and STEAM, college and career readiness, all kinds of things that kind of get rolled under that umbrella. The second area of need is enrollment and capacity. And so with enrollment and capacity, we're really talking about, is there any growth in the district? Are you stable, or is there any reduction that's happening? We look at utilization of your facilities. In some instances, districts talk about their boundaries, and in other districts, they also talk about consolidation of facilities. And then the third area of need involves facility condition. So we're really literally looking at, what are the condition of your facilities? Are there things that need to be repaired or changed in some manner to have them better support the educational programs that you're really trying to move forward here on the island? And as a general statement, I want to kind of go back to something that Fred made reference to earlier. In my mind, it's sort of a mantra that almost stands above everything here for your committee, is the idea that your community and the district do not build schools just because you want to build schools, right? You don't spend a bunch of money or do anything like that just because it's fun to do. You're doing it to support education in your community and the goals and vision you have for education in your community. And that's really what's all that this is about, is trying to assess whether or not the facilities you have are supporting those goals and vision and what you want to be doing with education here. And if they are not, what, if anything, might be done to better support those goals and vision. And it's always important to remember that in these categories, all the information we're going to be giving you are just facts. They're just numbers and just the reality of things. It doesn't tell you what to do with those facts. What it tells you are really the goal and vision you have, because you can always measure the facts that we give you associated with your facilities against these goals and vision to say, are our facilities helping us do those things? And if they're not, that is the thing that will help you begin to determine what, if anything, should be done. And really at the intersection of all these things, as you start to develop some priorities, as you understand the goal and vision better, that's where the long-range plan or options for plan proposals can start to emerge. At a very high level, what we're looking for is really the center diagram. And that is really a strategic phased plan through the management of your facilities over time. Because we recognize there's never been a district that we've worked with yet ever, and I don't expect there ever will be. But we'll be able to identify a huge amount of need which all districts have, and to be able to address it in one swoop. It's just not possible. It costs too much money. And the thing you want to avoid here is an ad hoc approach. You don't want to be just putting Band-Aids on things all the time. You want to be strategic about what you're doing in view of the vision and goals that you have. And this step right here is something that is going to be potentially different than was done by the first committee. If this committee determines that, yes, when we look at the need that you presented to us, if we read the issue papers and understand the detail that's in them, and we consider those against the goals and vision we have for our education, our community, we believe that something needs to be done. If you fall into that category, and if you believe that the something that has to be done might involve capital in some form, money, then it becomes a conversation of really what is the balance. Balancing the prioritized need based on your priorities and the level of support that your community might be able to afford or be willing to put out there in order to address some of the need. So, committee planning goals. We wanted to share with you sort of some of the key prioritized goals coming out of the 2019-2020 long-range facility plan. At the beginning of that process, for those of you who did participate, you may remember we had a sort of a goal setting session right day one, and really had an open forum where people could really talk about what their key objectives, hopes, and dreams were for education at Mercer Island. And we also went through a process where those were prioritized, again, because you may have 300 dreams and all that, but it's very important to understand of those, what are the most important to you? What are the key things? And what you're looking at here are a list of some of those goals, and you'll see some of the keywords sort of held out. So flexibility, the concept of flexibility and learning spaces is very important. Idea of occupational learning, so that is college and career education was talked about a lot, and we'll see that coming up later. Visible sustainability, recognition that there are traffic issues at some of your facilities, and the idea of safety around that was very important to folks. The idea of project-based learning was talked about quite a bit. The idea of the qualitative aspect of schools, spaces where students are excited to be in, happy to come to school, and hopefully energized just by being in the learning environment. Creation of collaborative spaces. Again, here you see safer pedestrian and bike access, so safety coming back into it. Recognition of supporting teachers and providing spaces for teachers. Improving gymnasium and athletic facilities. Thinking of outdoor spaces, rethinking outdoor spaces. So it's not just about the buildings themselves, but also the sites that the buildings are located on. And then finally, adaptive environments and accommodating future technology. So these were some of the prioritized goals right at the top. But we also went through an exercise where we looked at all of the goals. We didn't want to have goals just fall off the table simply because they didn't see kind of prioritized dots on them. So we took all of the goals and we started to clump them into themes to see if there were 6 or 7 or 8 cards that were really centered around a larger idea that might be useful when you're thinking about your facilities and whether or not your existing facilities are addressing these themes or topics in a way that you're happy with. And if you're not happy with them, then you can be thinking about what you might do to have them better support. So safety, when we did the themes, came right to the top of the cumulative number of votes for all the cards that were around a safety theme were 29. Flexibility and adaptability as a theme boiled right to the top. The idea of a diversity of space to support learning. So you can think of this as places like this room. So it might be places to learn outside of a typical classroom environment that really support different types of learning, large group, small group, project-based, and so forth. PE and athletics, considering programmatic needs, and you're going to see this bubbling up, particularly at the high school later on. There were a long list of programmatic needs associated with the high school that were identified. Here you see the outdoor spaces again, the occupational learning bubbled up again as a major theme, teacher support, learning for all, character and feel, so that qualitative component coming back in, recognition of food dining and social areas. So again, these are spaces that are outside of the classroom environment for social learning, sustainability and technology. And I will say that if you go in, I know this is going to be a tremendous amount of information for you to absorb, but if you go into the long range plan that's available to you, you'll see all of these goals coming up again. And so we'll always have that as a reference if you want to go back and look at that document. After we had the committee have an opportunity to identify goals and vision from their community member standpoint, we asked them to think about each of the sites within your district, each of the schools and sites, and whether or not those schools and sites met the goals and objectives that they had just voiced, the vision they had just talked about, or not. And so what you're seeing here is on the right hand, that's a no. They, in this group's opinion, decided that a given site, in this case, Island Park, I'll march down through this so you can see them. This is Island Park Elementary. Everyone felt pretty much that no, that particular school as it wasn't really in strong alignment with the goals and objectives that they had voiced, where they wanted to really see the district going. This one is Lake Ridge Elementary. No, and then just sort of a neutral, kind of in the middle for that particular school. So we can see Northwood, brand new school, yes, solidly. West Mercer Elementary, mostly no, but a few in the neutral. Island Middle School, and this is the older buildings now, not the newer buildings. So no here. Island Middle School with the new building, yes, they felt that met. And then Mercer Island High School here, kind of generally neutral, not a strong yes or no, so sort of in the middle. And I think that may be related a lot to what you're going to see associated with specific programs that were talked about and potential facility improvements associated with those programs. This one is Crest here, a strong feeling of no with some neutral. And then at the bottom, let's see what that is. Yeah, thank you. Admin, yeah. It's still pixelated. I can't see it. So. Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So after the committee had an opportunity to sort of think about how each of the sites related to their vision and goals, we then asked the committee, what, if anything, do you feel might be done to better align the facilities with the vision and objectives that were identified? And we had them do an exercise, which is very difficult to read, but I'll just give you an overall sense of it. For each of the sites, we had them break it down into categories. The one on the left was essentially just maintain, keep them operational. Nothing else needs to be done beyond that approach. The middle approach was a little more extensive. It was kind of a full modernization approach where you would say, okay, we're going to take the existing facility. We're going to do more than simply maintain it to keep its operations going, which means that we might reconfigure some of the space to create some of the different types of learning environments that were talked about. So learning outside the general classroom, flexibility, those sorts of things. We're also going to be thinking about the facilities in long term and in the event that a major systems replacement is warranted. So a complete replumbing, completely redo the electrical, completely redo the HVAC, upgrade the energy performance of the building by including the exterior envelope, basically making it a new building through a remodel. That would be this approach. And then the third approach was just looking at the replacement of that facility entirely. And we had the group break into different tables and talk about it, and then ultimately decide of those three general approaches, which made the most sense to them. And you're seeing a couple of examples of the sites here. And so on the right-hand side, in this particular example, which is one of the elementary schools that may have been Highland Park, approximately 70%, 75% or so of the votes were towards a replacement approach, with the remainder being on a modernization. And the question there was around, well, how did the cost between one and the other really compare? We're not really sure which way we're going to fall on this sort of a break. And then down here in the middle school, you can see the vast majority, and you've already started to undertake this with the new building that you've done as a first phase. Really more than 90% was leaning towards replacement. So from this exercise, a series of guiding principles for the plan were developed. The ideas were for elementary schools coming out of this to either as an approach towards aligning the facilities with the goals and objectives, either replace or fully modernize those schools, depending on the cost implication, with the recognition that most of the votes were actually falling in the replacement camp. For middle school, replace the remaining buildings, so continue that replacement approach for the middle school. For high school, renovation of the school over time on an as-needed basis, and limited modernization over time on an as-needed basis, with an emphasis placed on educational adequacy and programming. So that was really key for the high school, begin to identify specific programs and then align the facilities to better support those specific programs and their needs. For Crest, the idea at that time was to relocate and expand Crest in a new location that would be closer to the high school and potentially consider, there was a discussion about a co-location with the administration or potentially other programs as well. So that was thrown out as another possible idea. And then implement repairs as necessary at all facilities to maintain operations. So you can begin to see here some very specific strategies that are starting to be discussed by the committee. And we'll talk a little bit more about those moving forward. Okay. So here were the committee recommendations kind of boiled down into 3 basic ideas. At the elementary school, those recommendations were replacement of 3 older elementary schools, recognizing that the existing schools have significant deficiencies and that they need to better align with district standards. And so one way to think about that at the elementary is a document called an education specification. It was made prior to the design of this building, and that would be one of the standards for elementary to begin as a basis. And so the newer facilities would be closer to this building than they are now, although there may be some revision to that education specification moving forward. Replacement provides increased opportunities to improve sustainability, educational adequacy, and of course, just the general condition of building components. At the middle school level, the idea of replacing all of the older middle school buildings over time, and a recognition that the older buildings have significant deficiencies and that they also need to be better aligned with the district standards. There was a sense that the existing middle school environment feels disjointed and due to the differences between new and old and the physical separation between the buildings. The physical separation actually is a safety issue as well. So it was understood by the group that you've already completed the phase 1 building. There's been some real success there and a real strong desire held by that group to really finish that site out, finish the process for that. And there, of course, the middle school, one of the big benefits there is it will impact every student in the district because all your elementary kids will fall through that facility over time. High school modernization, emphasis on educational adequacy. And again, that's really built around that specific list of educational programs. Kind of getting to the end here, I know it's long and drawn out, difficult to separate through all this in a way. What we then did with the committee is we asked them to go through a prioritization process. So they told us now at that point, look, here are some specific strategies that we believe should be done to facilities in order to better align them. And then the question is, if you were to do them, what's most important to you? What would you do first? And the committee was broken up into a series of tables. Each of the tables explored their own discussion associated with prioritization. And these diagrams represent that sequence of projects. So when you see IP here, that's Island Park. So this is a Island Park first sort of sequence that was developed by tables. There was a middle school first sequence that was developed by tables. So Island Middle School, followed by high school and Crest, or in this case, Island Middle School, followed by Island Park. And there was also a sequential approach that was led by the first project out of the chute being high school project as well. These groups had an opportunity to get up and explain to the other groups why they had determined the sequence that they did, essentially explain and and really support the ideas that they came up with. And after a number of discussions and iterations, it was determined that a single approach, it wasn't completely unanimous, but almost entirely unanimous towards a prioritization in this sequence was really the forerunner that had been selected. And so this is what that really looks like. It was determined that the number one preferred approach would put Island Middle School in the first position. So it would be a replacement of the older school buildings on that site, with Island Park Elementary likely following that in sequence, high school and Crest, various projects there, and so forth throughout the district. And for those of you who may have looked at the document, we also tried to capture some of the specific comments, which are very pixelated here. You can't read them, but if you go to the long range plan, you'll see this, some of the specific comments that were made by the committee with regard to why they felt a project in a specific sequence was important or not. And that gives a little bit of insight into that whole discussion that was had at that point. So coming up on our last slide or two, some of the guiding principles associated with prioritization. So again, these are specific principles related to sequence. The idea that Island Middle School should be one of the first 3 projects. So you can see there's a little bit backing off on that. It leaves some opportunity for this group to say, you know, is it still number 1 or is it number 2? But it was felt that it should be one of the first 3 projects. It was also felt that Island Park Elementary should be one of the first 3 projects. And the prioritization for the remaining elementary schools at that time would be West Mercer and then Lake Ridge. And you'll see some of the whys, why in that sequence later on when we talk about need. And the first projects at the high school level should include college and career readiness, shared support areas, and Crest / administration, or it could be Crest, some form of Crest included in that. Then the idea that something should be done at every grade level as soon as possible. So it's really making sure that there is some benefit seen by everyone across the island when you start to make these improvements to align with the goals and objectives. And then prioritize improvement projects that have the primary purpose of supporting education. So that loops back and it really ties back to this core idea of anything you do with your facilities really needs to be all about that. You're not building buildings to build buildings, you're about supporting education. And the committee really felt that that needed to be said. It was very important to the core of this. So that high level, very high level, we have a few minutes here for questions, and open the floor at 5 or 10 minutes.
I'm wondering how the teachers' opinions are taken into consideration. That seems a lot more important than that.
Right. Yeah. When in a high level overview, we didn't really hit everything, but that's very important. And in the early phases of information gathering for the long range plan, we did actually reach out and talk to staff and try to gather information about what their key objectives were as well. And ultimately, where that really becomes important is when the projects, if there are projects that actually start to come out of this, your staff will be plugged in a continuous loop too. So it'll be part of this effort. We did not go back and interview them for this effort. We're just assuming that what they had said in the previous long range plan is being carried forward.
Well, I guess this is a question for Fred more than anyone, but it does seem like since the last time I participated in this, there's been a big movement towards inclusion. COVID's happened. I mean, it seems like maybe it would be worthwhile, or maybe Fred has a.
I'll speak to some of that. I'm next up. I'll speak exactly into that exact thing. So perfect.
I'm just curious, how the pool showed up on that 2 slides when it really wasn't considered any of the other prior prioritizations. And then-
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, that was a topic of debate, I will put it that way. And there were a few advocates in the room who felt that it would be very important to include the pool on a list. Far be it from us to say, no, that can't be the case. And so, given the discussion about that particular element, ultimately, as you see, everyone agreed that it would be the lowest priority of everything. But it did not fall off. It was important to people, yes.
Two-part question. Did you mention how long this previous committee worked? Did you say it was 9 months?
About 9 months.
During that time, did they visit other districts and other facilities? Recent work that had been done to get sort of a sense, or have you not gotten to that phase?
They didn't physically visit other facilities, but and as my recollection is now, what we did early on is we gave a slideshow of what we kind of termed modern learning environments. And the reason we did that, and I think this is probably to your point, is that a lot of people who aren't in education on a day-to-day basis don't necessarily know what modern learning environments look like, and the differences that are often found in them relative to new teaching methods or new teaching pedagogies. And so we gave that presentation early on to them. Yeah.
I looked at the white paper that said, there's no available parcels like available for development, that satisfy, the objectives. There is one potential parcel that could satisfy a number of objectives. That's a unique parcel at 7 acres on waterfront that could sort of satisfy a lot on the list. And so I think that it would sort of
Bring that up, yeah.
Significant input.
Okay, yeah, and that should kind of be rolled into the conversation, consideration of the program. Any other questions?
I think it was the last or maybe the second or third to last slide. It was prioritizing projects. Kind of seemed like it was in buckets of 3. This would be the 3 as we can do, or this would be this 3. So I guess the question is, how did you arrive at 3? Because it could be 2, could be 4.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say there's really no magic to that number. Yeah, I don't want to say completely pulled out of the air, but it's probably not more than that. And it's because it's an odd number, but it could be in the top 2 as well. And ultimately, if relative to that, if it turns out that this group decides, yes, something needs to be done with facilities, and then you say, yes, something needs to be done, and it may involve capital expenditure, then that whole balance discussion of level of support versus your prioritized need will really determine what the number really is. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, my recollection is when we were talking about it, we were talking about what things could kind of also be done together.
Mhm.
So it was kind of more that conversation than maybe the number 3. It was more, if you were to do X, Y, and Z, could these projects play off each other, or would they be helping the majority of students if we did X, Y, and Z, or staff, or whatever that case was? So if I remember, there was a lot of kind of grouping them in what at the time seemed to make sense without knowing, of course, the exact dollars and
Right.
all the rest that would have to go into it.
Yeah, and actually you see a good example of that here too, which is in line with those principles of do something at every level.
Yeah.
And so within these 3 is in middle school, something at the significant move in an elementary school level, and then also at the high school level here. That's not to say that the other facilities might not also see benefit in some way. It's really saying that major projects would be, potentially very good. any other questions before we break? There's some food and water. Okay, great. So let's take a 5 to 10 minute break. We'll call you back. There's food out there. Restrooms are, for those who don't know, are in the gymnasium to your right.
programs, offerings of the school district, and we always like to start, what are we about? And I mentioned that, Roy mentioned it again, but obviously, we're about the 4,000 students who are here with us each and every day throughout our schools. But as we think about building schools, we think about remodeling schools, we think about reconfiguring them, we always have to think about, well, in what ways does that impact our ability to do what we want in the classroom each and every day and maximize the learning experience for our students. So in order for us to think about engaging students in critical thinking and problem solving and preparing them for their world, we also need to think about our values around the whole child. And when we're talking about facilities, I can't think of any of these values, although they're all important and they're listed as bullets and not in numbered orders, just to demonstrate that one is not more important than the other. That is easier, especially for the big purchaser. You don't. Is it picking me up? There we go. Supporting the whole child is so interconnected with facilities. As we think about the experience of our students, both in the classroom, out of the classroom, on athletic fields, participating in different clubs and activities, our facilities are every bit as important to that as all of our instruction. And so as we think about our values and through, we also have to think about what are some of those fundamentals, and underneath the operational expectations of the superintendent, as I keep thinking of it now, maybe if I say it right. As we think about that, we have 5 fundamentals. And the first one talks about how do we personalize learning for our students? And we certainly can think about this building here and touring around this building and think about shared learning spaces, thinking about very intentional things we did with both a quiet dining area like this versus our full facility for eating there, a library right here. All of those are part of that personalization, maintaining our high standards for learning, social and emotional learning. How do we make sure that we're promoting that side of the student experience, analytical and critical thinking, and then certainly diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's always fun when you get to sit down and just think for a second, what are all of the different services and programs that students participate in and day out, and throughout a school year. And this list could go on and even further, and I won't list them all, but I think it's important to realize that in a one high school district, we sure are doing a lot. And that is not because of any one attribute of our school district, that is everyone working together. We know that when we survey other schools of our size, 3A schools in Kingco, no one offers more athletic opportunities than our students. When the first bond was being considered, we had 469 advanced placement tests taken. This year we'll have over 1,200 advanced placement tests taken. And so we continue to evolve and we continue to grow and get better. And it's because of all of these different services and opportunities that we provide. But I also think about what are the shortcomings of our current schools? What are the strengths of our more renovated or newer schools like this one? And then what else can we possibly do? So we start off with our educational program and planning parameters and starting to think about if we have an elementary school or a middle school or a high school, what is that general classroom capacity? What do we want that to look like? And, funding certainly drives this, but when we're thinking about programs and we're thinking about services, we start around 24 as our classroom capacity. We know that sometimes the classes get much larger. We were just talking, Deanna and I were just talking before this meeting of our time at Lake Ridge and some of the very high class sizes that we've had over the years. We've also had very small class sizes over the years. Our student representatives who are here, who came through all of our elementary schools and thinking about our days at Lake Ridge and West Mercer. I know West is best, Andrew, you can go ahead and say that. You were coming through when our schools were at their highest. And you were at West Mercer when it toppled 700. And we were at 620 at the height down at Lake Ridge, and Island Park was about 580. And so that's why this school came to be, is we had extremely large, but we irrespective of the size of the school, we try to always keep our classroom sizes somewhere around 24. It ebbs and flows and it gets larger and smaller. Thinking about our special services capacity in some of either our more self-contained programs or some of our flexible spaces, around 10. And then if we start thinking about utilization, how many of our classrooms do we want in use? Optimally, in an elementary school, you want all of them. You want all classrooms being used throughout the school day, with the exception of the time that students may go to PE, music, and so forth. So the target school capacity, and this can be argued and debated in many different ways, but somewhere between 450 and 600 is kind of where you want your elementaries, or where we feel like our elementaries are operating at their best. Lots of factors that go into that. Some of it has to do with just the overall space and that's involved, but you also have to think about the PTAs. And when you have more students, you have larger PTAs, you have stronger programming from your parent community. You also have more opportunity typically to have fewer split classrooms. You have full staffing of your music teachers, your PE teachers. And so having a school somewhere in that 450 to 600 allows you to program and carry out those aspects of education. You start getting much larger, which is where we were, and then you start running into infrastructure challenges and being able just to manage those schools. Down in our middle school, classroom capacities a little bit higher, around 28. We know some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. Again, thinking about our special services classrooms, around 10. But you'll notice here that there's a key difference, and that is classroom capacity goes down to 83%. So roughly 5 out of 6 periods a day, you have classes in a classroom. In our middle school, then that means that each of our teachers can have their own room. They're not sharing spaces throughout the day. It also allows for some of that setup to take place. And you'll see that also play out in our high school. It's really hard in a science lab to have it operating all 7 periods a day because there is setup time and whatnot in some of those, or you have transition. So somewhere between 5 or 6 periods a day for those classrooms there. So what do our schools need? As we think about Island Park, West Mercer, and Lake Ridge. The list is not exhaustive, but as I think about some of those key aspects of what are the shortcomings and what are we missing out on? First and foremost, the scheduling of those 3 buildings, from special services and special education to all of our interventions to even our library, music, PE, and art, is severely impacted by the fact that our gymnasiums and our cafeterias are the same building or the same structure. That really limits what you can do throughout the day. And I think that was one of the priorities of this building when we built it, was to make sure that the gym was in one space and our cafeteria was in another. Some other things that we have to think about is some of those flexible spaces. Lake Ridge has the long halls. Island Park kind of has the 2 squares, and then West Mercer has the 1 big square. Allows for lots of opportunity for movement. They're wide, and you can move kids around the building quickly, but there isn't a place to stop off if you're a parent volunteer or to provide intervention where you can stop off and meet with students. You're always right in the middle of the hallway where all of those other students are traveling by. Thinking about sensory rooms and having those in close proximity is a challenge. And then just thinking about some of our other intervention spaces along the way. At Island Park in particular, we also have 2 disconnected buildings. The gym and the cafeteria are not connected to the actual facility itself, which can pose some problems. We know we have issues coming off of Island Park. There was an accident just this morning out in front of Island Park, really snarling up traffic in there. And with that main thoroughfare, with trying to get a school started or a school ended, we definitely have challenges there. Lake Ridge, we have some issues in that main administration area, but then also thinking about where are restrooms located. And our kindergarten classrooms are way at the end of a hallway. and the restrooms are in a completely different area. And then West Mercer down here, we know we have drainage issues at Island Park, West Mercer and Lake Ridge on their fields, but also some of those limited collaboration spaces. When we look at our middle school, and we've got our main campus, we have 3 main buildings. And so students are constantly moving from building to building to building, which poses challenges with security, and also just getting students to their classes. And so that has been an issue. In terms of our older building, again, much like our Island Park in West Mercer, you have those big square layouts in that concept in terms of how it was designed, but there's not a lot of the flexible learning spaces in there. We don't have a lot of those common areas that are easily supervised, and so there's lots of nooks and crannies and large sight distances that can be a problem. And then just our acoustics and overall experience in the classrooms are really underperforming right now. At our high school, probably the area that we continue to grow the fastest in is college and career readiness, or our CTE programming. We have been able, through capital projects, to enhance a number of our spaces in that building, but we still have some shortcomings. As I look to Asha and others who are in journalism, that is one area where we know we could use more dedicated space with a better layout. Our broadcast studio has definitely need. I see 2 of our broadcast students. This program has expanded. We are probably offering more than a full-time teacher next year in terms of radio because of the student experience there. Our robotics lab, as Deanna and I have talked about, and Director Kuhn, our robotics lab definitely is not at the same standard as many of our other neighboring schools and school districts. And that program is another one of a great example of just blossoming enrollment. I think just 4 or 5 years ago, we might have had 10 students or so in our robotics team or club, and today we're around 80, give or take. And so we're seeing a quick escalation, and we need space there. From a science perspective, just our labs, we have aging facilities down that 100 hallway. We have been able to add on in the last renovation, that was part of the last bond, a couple of classrooms, which has been a great addition, but we could definitely need some improvements there. And then obviously in our arts program and visual arts. Also needing to think about PE. We've done tremendous, and we'll talk about it in a second, just with the tremendous project that we just wrapped up and is in use down in the South Mercer playfields. But we continue to just have infrastructure issues with our ability to house other teams for competitions with locker room space. Our performing arts center, we're improving it slightly. We're going to be doing some carpet upgrades. We'll be doing an upgrade with the scrim, and I think we're going to do the full curtains all the way through. But we've got some major work that we want to do in there as well, especially with black box theater and some other options for our drama program, which is another one that's growing. And then finally, just from a general education perspective, that school was renovated as part of the big project in the mid-90s. I think 94, 95, Brandy is up, or Tony is 94, 95 was the last major renovation. And some of our classrooms, it's time to upgrade in those areas. And so lastly, as we look through, how do we continue to think about some of those teacher office spaces? One thing we have benefited from at the high school is that our teachers do have office spaces, which allows us to have many more of the classrooms in use 6 periods a day instead of 5. But we certainly have some upgrades that we need to do there. Gender inclusive restrooms, we have a number of those throughout the school, but continuing to expand those. And then Crest Learning Center. We've certainly maximized that space, but we have a couple that if we could do some tweaks and changes, I think we could even improve that area. So what's been happening since our last committee met? Some pretty tremendous work that we've accomplished right here on this site, right over here as part of the build in when Northwood was put in, we laid out where we could put in new portable classrooms. And if you've seen the portable classrooms that we brought in, they're very different than any of the other ones in the school district. They look more like actual builds as part of the school and not these separate modules. But in that, we brought over our ATP, which is now called our Pathways program. Those are for our students who are age 18 to 21, who have graduated from our main campus at the high school, and they're working on transition skills all the way through age 21. We've also done an upgrade of the library and the culinary arts program at the high school. We've done the whole new South Mercer Playfields project, if you've been down there to be able to see that. Our Performing Arts Center, we have put in new riggings and some things that desperately needed to be done. Some new upgrades to technology in that space, but we're looking at other enhancements. We just redid all of the bleachers for the first time since they were originally put in with the high school back in the 50s. So those were upgraded this past summer. And then last but not least, we have electric charging stations that have been put in our transportation area. We have 2 electric buses on their way. One should be here soon, Matt, right? We got one. Will be here soon, and then the other one to follow. So despite the challenges, we continue to do great work. And I also want to just point out quickly, this building continues to be toured by others who want to come in and take a look at spaces. Malum, as an architecture firm and the school district worked really closely to make this happen. I think just 2 weeks ago, right before break, we had a group come through. And 2 things I'd like to point out. One is how impressed they are with the learning spaces and the way that we engineered this building and designed this building for students. And number 2 is how well it's taken care of. And our facilities have benefited over the years and probably have extended their life because of some really important work that's been done along the way with Director Kuhn, as well as all of our maintenance and operations team and our custodians. I can't remember the exact quote, but I think someone couldn't believe that we had some sort of type of tile and how good it looked. Why don't you have
The rubber floor in our hallways, the project manager for North Shore, she couldn't believe that it was a certain product because she'd never seen it shine that way.
And some of them, they couldn't believe the age of this facility, given the condition that it's in. And to us, that's just the standard of taking care of our facilities, but perhaps to others, it's not to the same degree. So maybe in some ways, we've done ourselves a disservice by making them look so great for so long. We certainly don't look at it like that. We look at it as we take pride in our facilities. We want to make sure that they are excellent for our students. And we also want to demonstrate to our taxpayers, all of you, that taking care of our facilities is really important as an investment, not just in our students, but in our community. Questions on educational program before I turn it back to Roy? Ralph?
This is new, or is this coming from the facility plan done earlier? This is all new, these are new slides.
Yep.
So the one thing that stood out to me was like IMS need for additional storage for science labs, something like that. Is that need? Trying to make lemonade out of lemons with the decreasing enrollment, are there some classrooms that aren't being used that would then provide that storage?
They could, in that 300 building, for instance, which is kind of that smaller building there, we could rethink a number of those. However, we've also, we kind of decommissioned some of the space when we opened up the new section of facility. In terms of it being usable space, we're saving hundreds of $1,000s a year by using some of the storage space at the middle school right now to store extra desks and different furniture that we were once paying outside down in Bellevue or wherever we were. So we decommissioned some of the spaces. And when you do that, there are some limitations to what you can use it for. So we have to be a little careful there.
Thank you.
How am I doing, Tony? Is that all right? Brandy, am I on script still? Yeah.
You'd mentioned a lot of kind of the geographic constraints at the older schools and the elementary schools in particular. Are there major kind of, I guess, engineering issues with there, like the HVAC systems or the insulation or the electrical systems that are being kind of patched along being so old, or is those in decent condition and we're really looking at like cafeteria, gym space as the major issues?
Does that come up more in the next meeting or a little later tonight? You'll see that a little bit later on. We'll do all the facility conditions and what that looks like. Yeah. And that's, of course, is the challenge of what do we put the money into now and what do we have to do? We redid the Lake Ridge roof, for instance, a couple of years ago. Well, that's one of those you have to weigh. Do we redo that now? Or do we postpone it? And there are some things you just have to do. Even though we may not get the 40 years out of the roof, we certainly need that in there. Yes.
So the list of things that we're taking care of from the time we saw you last, great. What's on the docket that we don't need to worry about, that already has money for? What's coming up?
Yeah, a lot of those are gonna be smaller stuff or even like boilers and some smaller behind the scenes things that aren't so great. But that have to be done. But Randy, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Great. Well, Roy, why don't I turn it back to you?
Is this working? Can you hear it there now? Should be. I can okay. Yeah, so I do want to address the last question a little bit more, actually. So one of the things that is a little bit more difficult to measure, so to speak, is what does it really mean to provide level of flexibility in a learning environment? And so I think a real simple way to look at that is some of the slides that Fred had up here, and I go back real quick. And yeah, like this is a great example. This is really kind of the options you have at a lot of your school. If you're either in the classroom or if you're going to do any sort of project-based work or individual work, you're anything in a hallway, basically, which, that's the way schools all over the place are, districts everywhere. It's very difficult, as you might imagine, when students are walking behind you and traffic and all of that. Now, fast forward to this school, where there are specific places throughout the facility designed to accommodate just that. It's really a diversity of spaces. And that really leads into sort of last point we wanted to make relative to educational programs. And so this is, again, is this kind of first big topic of the three topics that we're talking about, educational programs. And what you're looking at is just sort of another metric that gives us a general sense of where a given school or a school district's facilities might lie relative to other benchmarks. And so what you're seeing here, and I know it's hard to read because it's so pixelated, are different benchmarks. These are national medians for elementary, middle, and high school, and medians as it relates to gross square feet per student. So that's literally the area available in a school per student, the size. And so here you can see the national median is 137 gross square feet per student at the elementary level, 153 at the middle school, and 172 at the high school. And what these bars are in the blue are the gross square feet of Mercer Island school facilities per student. So you can see the elementary schools are 106, 102. Northwood, we're now, as you might imagine, higher number of square feet per student because it builds in those flexible areas, the diversity of learning spaces. And then West Mercer at 105. This also compares, and it's very light on this slide, to some of your peer or surrounding school districts. So here you see like Washington at 126 for elementary, North Shore at 141, Bainbridge at the elementary level 151, and Seattle at 167 based on their NSPEC. So it gives you a general sense of where you lie from the square footage standpoint. And this isn't intended to sort of the end all be all of metric. again, it just gives you a general sense of, okay, what does this really mean at the elementary level relative to where other districts are or where your new facility is, and the type of spaces it's providing in view of your vision and goals for education at Mercer Island. Okay.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
The areas where student, that's sensitive to enrollment, what enrollment numbers?
This is based on, that's a great question. It's actually based on the capacity of the school. So it doesn't take into account, these sort of fluctuations in enrollment. And so we'll talk about,
Well, if you're under capacity though, the effective.
more square
area
feet per student.
is-
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And so if you're 100 students lower than what your capacity is, obviously the square footage per student is higher. And what that could allow you to do in times of very low enrollment is you could use empty classrooms for out of general classroom instruction. But in view of the long term of the district, we know there are ebbs and flows, whether that be on a cycle of 15 or 20 years or 5 years. When your schools are back up towards capacity, that's the reality of the school. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you for that.
White box. Lovely.
The white box at North. Yeah, I think that is actually the added the square footage added to it. I think is that the gym.
High school gym versus.
Okay, yeah, okay, the gym. Okay, so some educational program takeaways to kind of sum this category of need consideration up. Older school facilities in the district do have significant need in terms of their educational adequacy and parity with newer facilities. So again, you can compare, say, at the elementary level, Northwood to your other elementary schools, and when compared to immediately surrounding peer districts. So as Fred mentioned, that includes at the elementary level, a lack of a separate gymnasium and cafeteria dining spaces, with exception of this school. Lack of distributed sensory rooms or safe spaces at the elementary schools, limited and or poorly configured special ed spaces at the elementary schools and at the middle school. Safety, security issues due to multiple buildings at both Island Park and the middle school. That's just traveling between buildings, going outside to do that. Need for expanded and or improved program areas such as science theater, career readiness, college readiness at the middle school and high school levels, including CREST. Very limited or no extended learning areas or flex spaces throughout all of the schools, but probably more particularly at the elementary and middle school level. And then in some instances, undersized general classrooms with insufficient storage and poor acoustical separation. Do we have any other questions about educational program area before we move on to the next area of need? Okay. All right. So next area is facility condition. And one of the kind of metrics we look at here, again, not intended to be the be-all metric, is just really looking at the general age of your facilities. We do this at any district, and it gives you just an overall sense of where you sit. And the reason this is important is some districts do have, say, half of their facilities or a third of their facilities sort of newer, and then maybe half of their facilities are 2/3 older. And that really becomes a question about how you're starting to think about and manage the older buildings over time, over the long haul over time. And what you see here is a number which we always sort of put a big asterisk on here. It's 55 years. That is not this magic line in the sand by any means of when your building spoils and it's time to replace it. That's just not true. But it is a number that was sort of scratched in the sand by the Government Finance Officers Association. We have conversations with districts, and really the sort of expected life varies all over the place. But generally speaking, it often falls around 70, 75 years as that kind of general expected life. Again, it's not cast in the sand, and it's certainly dependent upon how well facilities are taken care of over time. What you can see here is that you have a number of facilities that are really starting to well, exceed the 70-year or get it pushed right up against the 70-year. So that's something to think about. For those of you who have lived in the district for a long time, you may also recall that many of your facilities had a major renovation done to them. And the types of renovations vary on a facility by facility basis. We felt that was important to show here and recognize that. But what's interesting is it also allows you to recognize that some of those renovations are almost 30 years old.
I don't know if anybody in this room remembers when that bond happened. I know there are some long-term people here, but from the people that I spoke with that voted against the one bond measure, I believe when they raised the money for that renovation, they promised the community that it would last 50 years. And that, I believe that that was the number, and, please correct me if I'm wrong. But that's something that, at least when it's being discussed in the community, and needs to be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and definitely. And that's why we wanted to put this up here, because it is important to recognize that the community has made major investments in the facilities at different points in time, right? And I think it's also very useful to see and be thinking about, in view of that 50-year investment and the holdover, if you start to chip off or take care of an individual building in a cycle, and I'm just going to use one example, it may take you 5 or 6 cycles to actually take care of all of the buildings. At which point you kind of get down to this end of the line, and it'll be 50 years. It could very well be 50 years. And it's also important to note, and I don't have listed up here what exactly was in the scope of each one of these major renovations, but you're going to see some other charts in just a moment here related to facility condition. And it's important to note that in many instances, those major renovations may not always take care of all of the major systemic parts of the building. And so in, say, a given building, if the building is 60 years old and it hasn't had a major repiping of that system, the plumbing system has been replaced, it could very well be that it's starting to get towards the end of its clock, and that may need to be taken care of, which is a very significant expenditure, obviously. So, and there are other systems that are similar in that way. So here is that facility condition chart. Where these numbers come from there was a facility assessment done back when the long range facility plan was undertaken in 2019. That facility assessment and the scoring for it is updated and sent into the state on a recurring basis. And it's really intended to track, using a state template, the condition of facilities that are visible. Okay, so those things that you can see in a building without any sort of destructive assessment of them. And what you see here is a score that pretty much aligns in a way with some of the prioritization that you saw earlier on when we were talking about the committee landed on a certain sequence of projects. Those buildings that were included earlier on in that sequence, so let's say the middle school buildings, the older middle school buildings, 1 and 200, the 300 building, have some of the lower condition scores of all of the facilities in the district, as does Island Park. And then here you see the other 2 elementaries as well with some of the lower, but those 3 are pretty much in alignment from the facility condition score point with the priorities that were identified. And I also do want to note here that these scores are actually pretty good. And the reason I think they're pretty good is because, again, your buildings have been very well taken care of. And so when an assessor goes through the building and they're looking at the visual components, that's what they can score. Those visual components have really been maintained and managed very well. And hence, I think it's really taking older buildings. And for those visible components, keeping the scores pretty high. So that's great. I mean, your district is taking very good care of the investment that your community has put into these. And this is just kind of a quick photo essay of different conditions. I won't get into any of the specifics, but just sort of a reminder that each of the sites, along with some of the issues of some of the items that were noted associated with each, and then we'll go into them really brief detail in view of our time. So here you see, and when we say stucco and CMU, that's concrete masonry repair. So it's really, that's the exterior envelope of the skin of a building, just as one example. And you see, this is very common. This isn't just specific to this district, but we live in a rainy environment, things overflow and it creates damage and over time. So it's those sorts of things. Your newer facilities, of course, Mercer, just some of the recognized work that really needs to be done over time. This one you can note, it's not just necessarily things that need to be fixed, but it's also things like accessibility. And that really ties back to really equity and being able to create learning environments that serve all students, giving them really a fair shake at being able to use the facilities like they should be. Your middle school. High school, and these are some of the stuff you probably will recognize, so it's been taken care of, but again, just the items to be addressed. And again, it's not just the building, but also the site as well. I mentioned drainage on some of the sites as a note, addition, parking, circulation. And exterior conditions you see here, accessibility, safety issues here, surface where that's exterior envelope. Okay, so what's changed from when we met before in the earlier long range plan, and Fred touched on a few projects and some of the positive work that's been done since then. There's a little bit of duplication here, but significant work addressing facility condition completed since 2020. Lake Ridge roof was replaced, and hot water tank replacement. Northwood new modular building, including pathways program. You mentioned that being added on. West Mercer had a generator replacement. Island Middle School roof replacement at the 100-200 building. And we made reference to the fact that there are just some things you just need to do. You can wait longer, even though in the ideal world we would like to wait a little longer and use it as a strategy maybe. But that's an example of that. The high school library and culinary program improvements, and the bleachers, which were mentioned, and the roof replacement at Crest, and then some ongoing work at the pool building as well. And some takeaways related to the facility condition. Older middle school buildings have the lowest facility condition assessment scores in the district. So that's what we saw. And hence, I think one of the reasons why those projects are potentially prioritized right at the front of the project sequence. Island Park and Lake Ridge Elementary Schools have the second lowest facility condition assessment scores. Again, likely why Island Park was listed in potentially the first group of projects that might be occurring. High school building is in good condition, and Crest is in fair condition. Older facilities have a significant list of maintenance needs, so that was the long list that you saw each one of those. And then a chunk of those, as you probably already know, is handled by some of the additional monies, the CapTech monies that take care of that on an ongoing basis. And although the major remodels were completed on the old school, so that blue bar on the age diagram that you saw, this work is starting to get right around 30 years old, pushing up on that. And so that should just be a factor, but from the standpoint of previous investment that the community has already made, really respecting that investment, but at the same time thinking about where in its life that work might also be for each site. Okay, and that was facility condition in a nutshell. Any questions about facility condition, please?
In the new assessment, was there a difference with West Mercer and Lake Ridge? Because I noticed in the original planning committee, West Mercer was before Lake Ridge as far as work to be done. But here it showed Lake Ridge is actually,
I would have to go back and look at the individual scores. The scores did reflect work that was done.
The score at Lake Ridge now reflects the book.
Flex the roof, okay. Yeah, so did you hear that? So that those updated scores reflected the projects. I was gonna say smaller projects, there are really small projects that were done. Yeah. Yes.
does the condition assessment include seismic?
Well, not officially. We're sort of tracking separately seismic improvements that were made to buildings. And so that is a factor that's been taken into consideration for this track. And just to kind of expand on that slightly, the term sort of seismic is really an interesting thing to try to keep up on because seismic requirements are always changing over time. Right, yeah. So with every building code, there's adjustment to seismic. And also there are many, many factors that actually play into it. So it is, the primary structure of the building is what most people think about. That's been seismically improved. But in fact, if you were to build a new building, there are many other components that have their own seismic requirements, which you might not normally think about as being important, but I think the ceiling is a really great one. Where bracing for ceilings in modern buildings is much more stringent than its requirements. Why? Because ceilings can fall in seismic. And when they fall in front of doors that you can't open them. So it's things like that. So no district really that I know of, like seismic, really intends to try and make improvements to that level because it's just simply too overwhelming to be able to do that. And so what tends to happen is as buildings or as districts replace their buildings over time with newer buildings, that finer grain of seismic improvement just occurs as a matter of course. So mostly
Let me just add to that, that we have done a seismic assessment of all buildings in the district. We have a licensed structural engineer to look at those, and there aren't any major concerns in terms of exiting. I think what we said is that some of the older buildings in the event of a large quake might not be
reusable, right?
But they would be safer.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's another great point, Brandy, is that it's one thing. I mean, the sort of first bar to make sure you try and achieve is to be able to get people out of the building safely. But that doesn't mean that you'll be able to reoccupy that building because it might be damaged that you can't do that safely. And so just as a kind of little side note, one of the things that a lot of districts are doing, particularly in the last 4 to 5 years or so, is they're really rethinking schools as critical gathering facilities. So major seismic event, they're actually designed so that people who may have lost their homes or otherwise have a place to come. And so that's ultimately in the replacement of the building, some of the things that communities are talking about, and it really brings that facility up to a higher level of just getting out of it safely. So that's a good thing. Any other questions?
On the slide with the age of the schools, there's the bar and the blue line. You guys may have discussed this already, but I think it's worth considering, not necessarily deciding today. But on the high school, given that the 2014 bond measure had 10 million designated for building 10 STEM classrooms, we might be worthwhile putting the blue line in there. I don't know what warrants the blue line if it has to be completely modeled. renovating the entire facility. Right. But given it was a bond lender.
Yeah.
I think it was reflective. Definitely.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you're right. We should have that under.
Question was, in terms of the HVAC in response to COVID-19, weren't there improvements done in some of the schools?
We would have to.
No, we did not make improvements to our HVAC. We changed the filtration rates within our units, but we did not make any mechanical, we didn't change any mechanical.
Oh.
equipment. We were able to make the adjustments.
Good question. Anything else about facility condition before we move on to the last category? Okay. All right. We actually have a break. Okay. So 5-minute break.
Oh, and that. Kindergarten and preschool.
Right, great, that's the intent. So we're rounding the corner, coming down the home stretch for tonight. Thanks for hanging in. I know this is a lot, and it's just a lot to absorb. Okay, so the last primary area of need that we want to talk about is enrollment and capacity. And we will begin by just taking a look at the existing capacity of your schools relative to the target sizes that Fred made reference to early on in his presentation about education program. What you're looking at here are the target size. These are your elementary schools, obviously, and then the target range. And you can see that the capacities of each of your schools is right in that zone. The light blue is your permanent capacity. So that's the bricks and mortar building capacity. And then it's hard to see here, but the very light kind of gray color is an additional bump that's added by the on-site portable capacity. So those are those little buildings typically at the back of the building. And students have to walk out to get to that capacity of classrooms that are held there. And again, just as a reminder, capacity is literally the supply. It's how many seats you have available theoretically in the school, which is pretty simple math. The number of general classrooms at the elementary level times the target number of seats, the target classroom size, which is 24, knowing that that varies in reality, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but for capacity, we counted at 24, and assuming 100% utilization at the elementary levels. So you're right in where you want to be with that capacity. And then Island Middle School is just shy of 1,300, and Mercer Island High School is right around 1,600. And there aren't per se target capacities associated with those because there's really no foreseeable need that you're going to build another high school on the island, and no foreseeable need that you'll build another middle school. So the kind of are what they are, and they're well within reasonable ranges of target capacity. So that's pretty straightforward. So as many of you probably know, the district periodically works with a demographer to really look at enrollment forecasting. That's very oftentimes projecting out a 10-year increment. And so they have done that again. They've in fact engaged a couple of demographers to kind of compare where they might land. What has been found is that due to the pandemic's impact on student enrollment and a drop in that enrollment, that's what really triggered, okay, we really need to understand where we're sitting now with enrollment, that engagement of the two demographic firms. And now those were Educational Data Solutions and Davis Demographics. And each of those firms provided 3 projection scenarios in their report. So they had kind of different factors playing in, different assumptions around how they built their projections. So 3 different approaches, each one had 3 different approaches, really covering a very broad range of possible scenarios for enrollment trajectories over the next 10 years. So these were integrated into the trends and taking into account the local population growth. They, of course, are looking at things like birth rate, housing trends, and development. They look at what's happening around the given area and permits for what types of housing might be being built. So there's a lot of information going into these. Ultimately, after a lot of discussion, the district ended up settling on what is kind of termed the middle range forecast from the Davis Demographics projection. So that's Davis Demographics again was one of the two demographers, and they landed on using their middle range forecast, which happened to be very close to the low range projection, which had been made by the other demographer. And what I would say is, this is pretty common. Most of the districts that we work with, all of whom use a very similar process, working with demographers, looking at 10-year projections, almost always select a kind of middle range amongst the different models that are put out there by the demographer. So you guys are very much in line with what other districts are saying makes sense as well. So what are the trends? The district has experienced modest increases in student population annually in recent years. That's prior to COVID-19. But as I mentioned, COVID-19 pandemic did have an impact that appears to be kind of trickling down through the system over time. And in fact, in 2020, the district experienced a one-year decline of 6% or 250 students. So the demographers have basically said that those students that left the district that were already kind of in the process of the educational track in the district are not likely to probably come back. Some of them have moved out of the state. Some of them have been homeschooled and may continue to be homeschooled there. Others have maybe gone into enrollment in other independent schools around here. So it just needs to be recognized that some of the students are not going to be returning. So since the pandemic year of 2020, 2021, and 22, and 22, 23, enrollment at the elementary level has increased slightly, but both the middle school and the high school have continued to decline. And so the real kind of magic is the demographers trying to look into the crystal ball and say, okay, what does all that really mean in terms of likely future projections? And so this graphic is in fact just that. It's kind of tracking the projection. Here's where you are now, current 2022 enrollment at the different grade levels here. And when they track that out with the various factors they're using, you can see where they're kind of landing in that Davis demographic middle track, which is putting K through 5 at a drop of somewhere in the order of 2%, which is roughly 30 students or so. Grades 6 through 8, a drop of around 3%, and grades 9 through 12, a drop of 16% over time. And so what we then want to do is we want to compare that projected 10-year enrollment. So we look out 10 years and we really try and understand what that means relative to your available capacity and whether or not that suggests a strategy or not to try and manage this. So what you see here again is your existing capacity at each site in the light blue, and in the red you see the enrollment at the 10-year point for now for each of the schools. And so you can see at Island Park Elementary School, the delta is somewhere around 93 available seats at that school. At Lake Ridge, you'll have somewhere around 124 seats available. At Northwood, around 140 seats. And West Mercer, just shy of 100 seats available. Islander Middle School will have just shy of 400 seats available. So its projected enrollment is around 904. And the middle school will have about 340 seats available. Enrollment projection of just shy of 1,500 students. And so what are some of the takeaways from this? The student enrollments are projected to decline at all levels over the next 10 years. So you saw that decline. So 2% at the elementary, 3% at middle, and 16% at the high school. That the district schools are projected to be underutilized. In other words, you've got excess space available. And it's not a little excess space, it's a reasonably fair fairly large amount of space. At the elementary level, it's 454 seats projected of permanent capacity being available, so that's not counting the capacity in the portable buildings as well, so that's just permanent capacity. And you can see that's equal to roughly the target capacity of an elementary school. So it's pretty significant. 392 seats will be available at the middle school level relative to the permanent space again, and then 340 seats available at the high school permanent space. So that's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
A quick question, that's looking ahead 10 years from now, is that gonna kind of slow increase to that point? Or is there, is it?
It's actually a slow, it's a slow decrease.
Okay, decrease
Yeah,
that point.
So they're projecting, when you go back and look at their projections from where you are now.
Yeah.
It'll slowly kind of, it actually
Mhm.
sort of ebb and flows a little bit, but the trend is dropping.
Okay.
Over that period of time.
But conceivably, if an entire elementary school is going to be rebuilt, there'd be space for those students at the 3 other elementary schools.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it is, and that's a good point to make, is that the excess space you have available creates, we would call it swing space, basically.
I've been in the district long enough that I've seen my projections in both directions.
Yeah.
Right. They're never right.
Right.
And, one of the things is, could be, do they take potential recessive, economy into play?
Yeah,
And that's why we had the bubble.
Right.
It was, they were all 5 years old and the housing prices
Right.
plummeted on that, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, they're trying to take all of that into consideration. And it's a little bit, I mean, they will be the first to admit that it's a mix of art and science trying to do these projections. And that's why they do several projections with different factors. And it's always a conversation about, okay, here is this projection that takes these factors into account. There's another projection that adjusts these factors slightly. And ultimately, it's sort of a best guess of, where does it appear that it's going to land. And what I would say is that the numbers, when you look at their translation of numbers over time, collectively, it's pretty significant when you add it all up. And even if the trend weren't exactly as they sort of mapped it out, because of the level of significance that you're seeing here, it might back some of this up, but it's still relatively significant. Yes.
When was the study completed or studied?
It was just done several months ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a couple of months ago. And there was, pretty significant and in-depth discussion where we've taken a look at each of the 2 demographers. And I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but really the primary intention of engaging 2 demographers is to really do as best due diligence as you can, cross-referencing. And I would, in my experience, that level of due diligence is typically not done by districts. They usually have a go-to demographer that they use. And they have the conversation amongst the models that one demographer builds. And they pick which one makes the most sense to them. They don't really go with that too.
I mean, this is kind of a question and a comment. I mean, for me, the forecast, I mean, we had the COVID thing and that really probably shocked the system and, they probably weighted their forecast probably more heavily on that COVID thing and maybe 5-7 years from now, it might not be the same. And so for me, it's like, how much, weight we really put into the forecasting. I mean, it's kind of hard to plan and use this as scripture when, who knows, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think that, I don't know, Brand, if you want to chime in on this, because I know that you went pretty deep into the report, but the point that you're touching on is in fact one of the core differences between the different models they looked at. And in fact, I think it's true that one of the models they looked at really took the trend as established by COVID, which you could say is, well, that's, extreme, right? This pandemic event. And really looked at that playing out. which is the sort of worst case. That's not what we're looking at here at all. That was so extreme and so worse that people even said, that's not a correct way to do it. And so the model that was selected is, if you look at a spectrum of the different models, it's probably about in the middle or so.
Interesting that the birth rate, I mean, birth rate dropping.
Right.
And so if you're not making more kids, you're not educating more kids. So right now in this area, there just aren't more little people being made. So that, COVID or not, there just aren't kids coming, and there aren't houses available that are affordable for families. And anyone who looked at a house anytime in the last 2 years and looked at a house that was under, let's say, even 2.5 million, you know that's true. There's nothing here for young families.
But there's actually more young families than you expect that are buying houses in that price range as their home because they weren't buying a previous home. So there's more families that can afford that than we all thought was the reality.
So I would say, I recall that there was last Hendricks and demography presentation. I forget what he says, I think he basically says first 5 years, pretty good. Beyond 5 or 10.
Yeah.
Anything can kind of happen.
Yeah, that's kind
And
of.
did he restate that? Is it 5 years?
Both stated that. But I think they're quite clear. They give 3 to 5 and beyond that, we'll see what happens.
The other thing I was just gonna say as an observation is that, like, so in terms of when we think about this, you know, the facilities plan piece of it, looks like there's capacity is not gonna be an issue, right?
Yeah.
And so that lends me to think, you know, maybe there's room to be more flexible with some of the common space or some of the rooms could be pivoted to something else, or there was a comment about, you know, consolidating a school and then remodeling, you know, one of the schools while putting all the excess students in the other, you know, residual schools.
Yeah.
So to me, that there's some flexibility there. It's a positive.
And where you're going is exactly where you should be going, which is now with this information, you can start to be thinking about, okay, does anything, now that you have this information, need to change, whether it be, you know, fixing stuff on the one hand or being more operationally efficient on the other side. There are lots of different things to consider and a number of different strategies that should be discussed, which will be exactly what you're doing in the next 3 meetings. And to your head, I might down there. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
I just have to sort of go back again to the project I was on 12 years ago. And as Ralph just reminded me out in the hallway, our focus was really on enrollment at that point. We were way overcrowded. You talked, I think, about the numbers that was mentioned earlier, all 3 schools were over capacity. And so ultimately what it led to was a 4th elementary. Well, now we see that it isn't really a capacity issue, but, you know, you talk about repurposing Island Park. You know, at what point it's not cost effective to try to repurpose that building? First of all, it's a 1950s teaching style of, you know, these prison-like rooms and hallways. So I think we have to balance the thought of enrollment and opportunity to provide with some structures that just are so adequate.
Yeah, exactly. And so there you go. You're both going down that track. These are all factors, and it's, you know, they're all interrelated. So again, you know, the age of the facility, the types of learning environments that it offers to students, as you're talking about, is one big factor. You know, to your point again, enrollment, you try and take advantage of some of the spaces that might have become available because of lower enrollment in certain instances, or are there ways, to your point in the back, where now you can take advantage of significant enrollment and either use a school as a swing space during construction or consolidate or some other approach too. So there are lots of different approaches out there that can be studied for very different reasons. And the sweet spot, which was, remember the center of the kind of Venn diagram at the middle, the sweet spot is really trying to come up with, in my view, a strategic approach that really sort of checks off as many boxes relative to your key objective and vision as possible, right? For every move you do, if it turns out you say, yeah, capital is going to be involved with this, let's talk about money. For every dollar you spend, how do you leverage the highest benefit for your community? For every strategic move you do, make sure that it checks off as many boxes as possible.
And when we talk about flexibility, your thought was, I was already there, and I think that's great, but I did read in one of the reports that the older elementary schools can't be built with a second story. Can this one be added on upward? Is it, structurally sound to do that?
Right.
And when the bond didn't pass for the 3 new elementary schools, one of the constraints was the Boys and Girls Club, the old one, that property was sold. And then everybody was up in arms for, why did we get rid of this property? We weren't thinking down the road. So when we build that flexibility in, we want to make sure that should those forecasts in 5 years live, that we haven't painted ourselves in the corner.
Exactly. Great thinking. You're going the same path too, is always remember that the decisions you do now in the 5-year period, the 10-year period, or even 15-year period, you don't want to close a door, and once it's closed, you can't open it again. And specifically to your point, is property, right? If you, especially when you live in a very well-developed area and property isn't available or it's incredibly expensive, you don't want to sell your property. Really.
I've got one follow-up on that, like, this used to be Mercer Crest Elementary School, and the city sold it. And then ended up buying it back. Mercer View.
Mercer View was sold.
So that's exactly, and then so that makes it harder to raise money the next time, because people go, well, wait a minute, we have this property, we sold it, and then ended up buying it back. I think, I don't know all the details, but it was kind of a little bit of a mess. And so, as we think about this, we have some good property. Let's figure out the best way to optimize this.
Exactly. And keep in mind that, again, the decision you make now doesn't necessitate a sort of co-decision. So let's say if you made a decision where you were going to, maybe make less use of a given property, or however you put it, it doesn't mean that you should turn around and sell that property too. Those two things are not linked at all. As are any number of decisions that you make with regard to how you want to manage your facilities over time. Other questions? Okay. And we'll be talking about all of these factors more in the coming meetings, because you're going to be broken up into small groups, and you're going to be starting to do the real hard work with it. And there'll be lots more questions. And so we'll be coming around and trying to answer and get your minds thinking different strategies as much as possible. But ultimately, it's going to be coming from you guys. So, okay. So we're going to roll into super exciting thing.
This is what you all waited for.
Right?
School district financing.
We'll do that. Perfect.
Welcome again. My name is Matt Sullivan. I serve as the Executive Director of Finance and Operations for the district. I'm relatively new. I started back in September. Prior to that, about 8.5 years with the Vashon Island School District, doing a similar position. So I kind of island hopped. Overall, I have, 24 years in public sector finance, budgeting, and operations. So here's the apex of the evening: school district financing. It says fun like school district finance. I want to give you, in this little graphic here, an overview of the 30,000 foot perspective, if you will, of how are we funded, Mercer Island School District. You can see there's 3 different pots of money. Basically, we receive to continue to contribute to our operations. We get 25% from the local levy, or $17 million. That's our EP&O, Educational Programs and Operation Levy, along with our Cap Tech levy. The big one in the middle is what the state funds. It is roughly 71.3%, what we know as a portion, and basically what does our enrollment fund. And then to finish this off, we have federal and other 3.7%. That comes from grants that comes from the federal government through the state to us that we have to apply for. And then also wonderful things like the Mercer Island Schools Foundation. One thing to note as we talk about facilities and buildings, the state of Washington provides almost nothing to us, no revenue for maintenance and capital construction projects. That said, back at that 2014 bond at $98.8 million, There was some matching dollars given to us, almost $3 million, that basically went to fund to pay the taxes back to the state. Voter approved local funding, like you mentioned, bonds. It provides funding for the capital projects, such as purchasing properties for schools, constructing new schools, or modernizing existing schools. Those bonds are sold once approved by you all, us, all the voters. And in 2014-2015 situation, those were split at $98 million and sold over two kind of tranches, if you will. And they're repaid kind of interest. Think of it as a mortgage, if you will, over a period of time. In our case, they were 15 years, and they'll be cured in 2028 and 2029. And it requires a super majority to pass 60%. So it makes it quite difficult for many school districts to build those buildings to fund themselves that way because that 60% threshold. The other side of it is our levies. Like I said, EP&O. It provides for fundings for our programs and services the state does not fund or fully fund as part of basic education. It can be short-term local property taxes passed by us, the voters of the school district. Requires simple majority, which is nice, 50% plus one. And like I said, I mentioned two of the three. There's three types: enrichment or EP&O, tech, capital projects and technology levy, and then also transportation, which we did as a district pass, I believe in 2016, about $750,000 for new buses for the district. Like I said, levy types, enrichment levies, EP&O, formerly known as the M&O levy. It really goes to subsidize what the state doesn't provide to us. It funds our teachers, our support staff, supplies and materials, or like I said, services that the state only partially funds. Can be approved at 4 years. It goes from 1 to 4 years. We recently passed this levy back in February of 2022 for a 4-year levy at 73.66%. So very nice. And then our tech levies, they fund things like modern technology. I look at Andrew Reeves, our tech director over there. Wi-Fi to, I want to say iPads, but our notebooks for all of our students. To minor kind of capital projects. I look over Tony, our director of maintenance and operations. But it can't fund those large, massive projects that we talk about. That's where the bonds come in. But we did pass this for 6 years, and they go from 1 to 6 years in our cap tech levy at 72.12% back in February of 2022. And then once again, the transportation levy, which we did pass back in 2016, and that was for $750,000 for new buses. And then some of our district bond history, the 2014-2015 bonds. Demolition of North Mercer campus and construction equipped the new elementary school, which we're standing right now. And then the complete demolition, rebuild, modernize a portion of our middle school. The expansion, Mercer Island High School, I mentioned earlier briefly, the 4 science labs and 6 general purpose classrooms. And like I said, also the 14-15 bonds will be fully retired or paid off in 28-29, about 15 years. But those can go up to 20 to 25 to 30, kind of depending on, like I mentioned, your mortgage, kind of the amortization schedule, how you want to do that. But sooner, as quickly as you can, is typically better. And then the 2002 bonds, which are definitely not paid for. I think we mentioned that briefly in some of the conversations. Replacement of stadium, field, and track, and then fully retired was paid off December of 2017. Then down here is a little chart. You can see what passed, what failed over the course of many years.
That April of 10 years ago, that was the idea to modernize the elementary schools. Is that what you guys were referring to before?
This is before Matt's time. I believe so. Is that correct? Randy or
Which one was it?
that was 2012. Is that
Yeah, the
correct?
one that failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the one that failed was, the proposal was to rebuild all 3 elementary schools and the middle school all at once. And that's the one that failed. So then we went back, and many of you were in there, and that one was gonna be, that one was the one that ended up passing, which had the high school and middle school and then 1 elementary. So you were,
Not technically all at once, because the elementary.
well, over time,
But they were all.
they were in the package.
It was not gonna.
Right, like rebuilding. One thing I want to point out is, and I hope we don't continue the pattern. Not shown here, there was a bond, I think 92, 91, 90, that was gonna replace those 3 elementary schools that got significantly modernized with the ones that passed. And there seems to be unfortunately a pattern of going out to the voters with a really big package, getting it voted down, coming back in 93 and 94, getting it passed. And the same thing happened in 2012. It failed, and the more modest, or however you want to call it, then passed. And that process really takes a lot of toll on a lot of people. So if we could, as a group, recommend something that passes, that'd be a lot easier for a lot of people.
That's what we're trying to do here. Dash and Allen saw something very similar. They went out to a $78, $79 million bond. It failed miserably, I think, in the 40% threshold. They went back, did the process again, went to, I think, a $49 million bond, that passed. So it's out there. It was.
I was gonna say, I think to my recollection, again, to my point I made earlier, I think one of the thoughts the last time was if you touch more age groups and students who had a better opportunity to pass versus doing all 3 elementary schools, which really just touches a portion of it, although it really helps our community overall. We all understand that. But I think if we, whatever we put together, if we can focus on touching as many as we can in a way that makes sense, you're gonna get much more buy-in.
I don't expect you to do this, but maybe for the next time. What was the property tax lift that was, what's the difference between $196 million and $98 million in terms of impact property tax per thousand?
Sure.
So that, I know, you can't do that, math, but it would be great. Yeah. Where people are willing to pay and willing to not, maybe it's that 198 million number, or maybe it's what they're looking at on their.
So I can provide a little input on that. In the following meeting is what we're giving you some tools that you can use for your discussions. And additional information. And what you just mentioned is some of that information. So we'll be able to give you a sense of, a given amount of a bond. And again, I want to emphasize here that the initial question of whether or not the facilities align with your vision and goals for education, and the question around, is there anything that needs to be done? That's a hurdle. That's a yes or no. Either no, everything is fine just the way it is, or no, there are some things that we probably should be talking about here. That's the first hurdle. The second hurdle then is of the things that can be done, do any of them involve capital, yes or no? So these are questions you'll ask yourself. If you clear those hurdles, and I'm not here to push you into that position, but if you clear those hurdles, then you'll have tools available to you. It'll say for this amount, this is what the implication of your taxes are. Because of this whole conversation, the points you're making are spot on. Really, the idea here is that you have these discussions and you determine within the context of, you're going to hear this a lot from me, I apologize, that your values and goals as a community, right? Where your priorities lie, you understand what the reasonable order of magnitude cost is to achieve those. You can judge whether or not it's in alignment with how many of these things you can achieve. It's in alignment with your community's ability and willingness to support it, because if they don't support it, it's a moot point, right? It goes down in burning flames, and what's the point of that? But that's the conversation that we're going to be having, or actually you're going to be having. So our job will be to empower you to move.
Just one more comment to respond to the comment about when we come out of this with maybe a plan that sort of addresses the broadest number of kind of students, if you will. I think it's important to remember in the community that there's a significant number of voters who don't have kids in the schools anymore. And so, trying to spread the interest across the parent population is great. But it's, I think certainly I learned from the prior experience that that wasn't enough. And so it's also an element of how, what do we convince the rest of the community that why this is necessary?
Yeah, no, 100%.
I believe the number 2/3 voters do not have student interest. So a lot of people are educated.
And I will make a comment on that too, I think, which is relatively relevant. I think when you start to have these conversations in the next meetings, particularly if they end up involving capital support. I think one mantra that will always encourage your groups to be thinking about is in view of the point you just made about people who don't necessarily have children in the district anymore, right? And that mantra is clear, concise, compelling. In other words, along with the proposals or the recommendations you're making, the rationale behind them should be clear. And you have to be able to say it in not some long, overdrawn story. It has to be concise. And the biggest thing is that when people hear it, they need to be able to say, I hear what you're saying, I get it, and I can support that. And that's the compelling part of it. And for every discussion you have, you need to be asking yourself those questions. Is our reason clear? Is it because really compel people to support it?
This slide may help a little bit just in regard to your question. You look at 2003, in black line, we are present, 2023. Said homeowner property on the island is paying about $1.29 for 1,000 assessed valuation. The light blue is debt service. That's going to be mortgage on bonds. The yellowish color here is cap tech levy, percentage that, and then EPL is that dark color. You can see at the point, said bonds are paid, cured, if you will, that drops off at that point. But it's tough to predict moving forward. As you can see, when the recession hit, typically what happens as property values go down, rates go up, and the inverse is true.
What is the cap on levies now? It must change, right?
It's the EPNO has a cap on it.
It's a real
Yeah.
quick, like, sort of, because it makes a big difference in explaining it to people. It's true that for our local district, if you take the bar graph, like the EPNO levy amount has gone down significantly, like 2017, it was 17 million. Now it's 12 million, but like inflation, right, it's even less. However, 38% of local property taxes go towards the state general fund. And that is increased because of McCleary.
Right.
So in terms of,
That's where the cap is.
well, so in terms of the tax burden, it is increased, even though what we're imposing in the local district has decreased.
I've got another just comment question in terms of like thinking through this, as these bonds mature or, retire. That's, debt or taxes that the homeowners are paying, and so that's probably a better time to go back. Right, because they're kind of used to paying that. Wouldn't you say, I mean, like they're kind of used to paying that certain amount.
Yes.
Some of them might want to say, great, I don't have to pay anymore, but like it's already kind of there, you kind of, so I don't know, like, what's your experience with that?
My personal experience is that districts try and do exactly that.
Building on your question on that, when you look at that graph that's just over there, the fall off there with the castle bond is what, 2029, 2028. That's a few years from now. Are there, can you pass a bond that's very small, a couple years, and then fills in that gap later, so that the message is it's not going to increase your taxes? Right. It basically fills in, like pass it a year or two earlier, or is that seen as gaming it too much? Or
We would always try to do something like that. We try to have them bash on as much as we can, working with our bond agents. In this case, it was Piper Sandler. There's also DA Davison out there. We'd always try to do that, try to smooth it out, if you will, try to amortize it out as best possible, so you don't have, said homeowner doesn't have that shock, that effect.
So yeah, they're, and I'm not an expert at this, I'll tell you right now. That's why Piper Sandler exists. But yes, there are a number of different ways that they structure the debt. And one of the reasons they do that.
Simple things from you 15 to 20, you 2025, or a second. Here's a great slide, just taking a look at what is our school district tax rate compared, similar assessed value districts around the area and around the region. Where do we stand?
One other quick point I wanted to make. We're talking about is one of the strategies you'll often see when they structure the debt is a plan stepped in. And so when you think about this in terms of the long range facility plan, and what I mean by that is that what you do, what might be called phase one, is done with the understanding of what you might most likely do in the next phase. So your community, the benefit is that your community sort of knows, oh, I understand we're doing this now, and we're taking this big of a bite at the apple, and I understand that this is in context of what would happen next time, so I know it's going down the line. It builds that longer term understanding, and from a debt standpoint, they structure it so if the step down allows for that possibility to actually happen. And that would be down right.
Why aren't Bellevue's in the front? Included any of our comparisons, whether it's here or on the early slide, showing our schools compared to sort of neighboring districts. It seems like Bellevue is probably the most logical comparison.
We could typically look at least working with our bond agents around what's typical assessed valuation would be kind of similar that way. So it's more apples to apples as opposed to apples and oranges, but we could.
Favor to ask, and this is a very popular type of table to show, but it can be disingenuous to homeowners. We also need to look at the average price of a home. Sure. Because we're trying really low, but the average house value is 2 million. And so it'd be nice in future reference to put that number down.
Well, in the commercial property tax, right? And the assessed value.
Yeah, to your point. The homeowner quotes all of this, whereas in Seattle, Bellevue, the residents, we told me 50%.
And once again, the some takeaways. Current tax rate of $1.29 per thousand of AV for all bonds and levies, in which the breakdown is 41 cents bond payments, debt service, if you will, 35 cents goes to cap tech levy, 54 cents to P&L levy. And looks at the current bonds will expire in 28 and the other half in 2029.
That was much more exciting than I think people expected. Good stuff, thank you. All right, last slide, next steps. Okay, so mark it on your calendars if it's not already on there. May 1st. A couple of things I did want to touch base with you on. Well, one of them is there is a plan afoot to hold our subsequent meetings at the other elementary schools. We'll be rotating through.
I think actually we're gonna do one elementary and then middle school.
Okay, there you go. And the exact location, correct me if I'm wrong,
To be
will be sent to you. So hold your breath on which one it is. And the purpose behind that is, you've seen this school, you sort of had a chance to walk around a little bit. For those of you who may not have seen every other school facility recently, this will just give you an opportunity to do that, which I think is really a great idea. The second thing I wanted to touch on is a quick question. We are meeting from 5 to 8. Is that doable, or is there a strong need to push that back a little bit? Like in terms of folks coming from wherever you might be coming from, or are you feeling okay about this time? Right. Generally feeling okay? And it's okay too if some of you, just because you have lots of things in your life, if you come in at 5, 10 or whatever, that's okay. We're just happy that you're here and happy to have you. so please come back. Yeah, and we're gonna be diving into kind of some preliminary plan proposal discussion, which is really the fun stuff now. Like I said, we'll bring you those tools, we're gonna break you up into some small groups, you're gonna pick some ideas around, you're gonna get a chance to present to the other groups, all things like that. So, any last questions? We're actually getting up early, which is unbelievable. Yes. Yeah, so Brandon. And for those of you who have not had a chance to kind of read through those super exciting papers that we've posted out, we're taking a look at the report. Spend a few moments to do that, and it's useful before the next meeting. All right. Unless there's the last thing for good of the order, I'm gonna close it off. Okay, thank you.
So you have plenty of other.